Muffy Whitley, being interviewed by Allison Mitchell.
Good morning, Muffy, or as you are officially known, Elizabeth Diodati Griswold Whitley. And would you like to explain to us what the significance of the Diodati is in your name?
Well, it was an ancestor of mine married a Diodati, a Sarah Diodati, and their child was named Elizabeth Diodati, and since then there have been Elizabeths every generation, but only every second generation is the Diodati. But it seems to have ended with me, as my granddaughter name is not Elizabeth Diodati.
It is not.
No.
Oh,
She does have Elizabeth in her middle name, but
okay. Not, okay.
So.
Well, maybe it'll be picked up in another generation.
Who knows?
Who knows,
Who
yes,
knows?
who knows.
Like,
Well, Muffy, you and I have been friends for a long time, and I'd just like to ask you a few things about your life here in Oldham. You weren't born in Oldham, is
no,
that-
actually I was born in New York City.
And
My parents were living out on Long Island, but I think my grandmother Marsh didn't like the idea that what was the hospital out in the boonies of Long Island. so she and her husband put my mother up in a hotel in New York, and this was right at the height of the crash. And it was
and so what year were you born?
1929.
1929.
And my mother has horrendous tales of waiting day by day in this hotel and seeing all the devastation that the crash was creating in New York with the businessmen.
Right.
Yeah.
Terrible. It was a very, very tragic time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when did you move to Oldham?
You know, I don't honestly know. My parents moved back, or my father came from Erie, Pennsylvania. They moved back to Erie for a couple of years. I would say probably I was 3 years old, but I don't honestly know.
Okay.
Moved back to Old Lyme.
And did you build the house up in the hill there off of Mount Creek?
No, my grandfather built that. He built it originally as just a one-room lodge to get away from all the women in his family. He at that time was living with his wife's great-grandmother, her great-aunt.
Oh, wow.
And so he built this one room. He was going to raise pheasants, and unfortunately the land he picked was in the woods, and he didn't count on foxes.
Oh,
So the idea of raising pheasants didn't last but a year.
right, because the foxes would get them. Yeah.
So
Well, describe
then he added on to the house, and his family moved.
I always thought it was a very intriguing house. Can you describe it to us?
Yeah, it was a wonderful house, certainly a wonderful house for children to grow up in,
Right.
because it was basically all wood, pine wood walls, and kind of indestructible. And the house grew like topsy, as my grandfather would decide. He would add room after room, and
And they would go down on different levels, as I recall.
it was at a couple of different levels.
Right.
It only had, it was a great house to grow up in as a child.
Were you the youngest, or where were you in the?
I had two older brothers and a younger sister,
Okay.
so I was kind of in the middle, and all I wanted to do was do what my brothers did and follow them. And needless to say, they didn't want a bratty little sister following them around. So it was a tug of war.
And
Me trying to follow them and them trying to get rid of me.
oh dear, when they had lots of woods to.
Oh yes, lots of woods. It, and it's so too bad today that children have to be totally supervised and confined constantly.
Yes.
Whereas when I grew up, you were free to roam wherever and get on your bicycle and go where you wanted to go. And
Yes, I remember saying, okay, just be back in time for dinner.
yeah. Well, it really it was so completely different than today that there's really no comparison.
One of your father, Roger Griswold, had a good friend named Townsend Lunnington, and can you describe what they were involved in, the two of them?
My father was an aeronautical engineer, and whether Uncle Townie, as we called him, was an actual aeronautical engineer or not, I don't know, but he obviously was very, very interested in airplanes. And they were friends, and then they started a business together. Really, the Townsend Lunnington was the money, and my father was the ideas.
And what was the concept?
Well, they worked on many different patents for airplanes airplanes were all being developed at that time, and there were many, many different aspects that they worked on. But the Second World War came along, and by golly, the government leapt on it, any manufacturer to do anything to help the war effort. So they built gliders for the U.S. Army at the Pratt Reed factories in Deep River.
Deep River. I remember going there and seeing these gliders. They were amazing.
Yes, and that's really where the idea of the three-point seatbelt came into being, because these troops that were carried in the gliders, when they would land, if they just had a seatbelt on, they'd fall forward, and many of them were injured, some of them seriously. And so my father developed the idea of a three-point seatbelt, which after the war he tried to get the car manufacturers to be interested in, and they couldn't have cared less, turned him down flatly. So he went to Saab, Volvo, not Saab, take it back, Volvo, and by golly, they were interested. And
So he sold them the idea?
he sold them,
Did your father have the patent on the three?
Yes, he did,
Okay.
yeah. And so the first cars that were in this country that had the three-point seatbelt were Volvos.
Volvos. And I remember you had a Volvo, right?
Right, because we could get the Volvos at a good price. And
I was very impressed that you had a Volvo,
yeah, because at that time, most cars in this country were American made.
Right.
They
We had
were-
a Pontiac.
Right, or
Because
a Buick, or a...
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So during the war, was your father working for the government, or what was?
Basically, during the war, my father worked for Sikorsky Aircraft down in Stratford, and so there was rationing for cars, and just, pleasure cars got very low quantity of gasoline that they could use. But my father had a car, and he had a higher rate because he had to commute to Stratford every day. And I can remember my brothers trying to get him to let them use his car.
Uh-huh.
But that didn't work.
It didn't work.
No, it didn't work.
So, one of the other things that your family did, you were very instrumental in the beginnings of the Old Line Beach Club,
Well,
right?
yes, the 38 hurricane wiped out the house at White Sands that several different families in town owned jointly and used to go use, just their families use it. And when that house was gone, they were like, where are we going to go? And my father knew that my mother's great uncle had an abandoned boys camp on the beach
Wolcott Lane.
and Wolcott G Lane.
Right.
And so he got them together and voila, then the beach club was formed.
Yes. And you were charter members, right?
Oh, yes. I would almost think now that Townie Ludington's gone, that there's maybe nobody, but maybe you, Allison, who since 1939,
Yeah.
every single summer has gone to the Old Line Beach Club. Yeah.
Well, you know the story, my story was that after the hurricane, my mother and I went down to see if the beach club was still there. And because we had heard that the houses in White Sands were gone, and we were very relieved to find that it was there. And also your Nonsuch. Tell us about Nonsuch.
Well, Nonsuch is one of the original buildings. It was just farmland, all of it, only with just, I think, 2 houses. My great-great-aunt, Sarah Lane, Sarah Griswold Lane, built.
Sally, right?
She was Aunt Sally.
Yeah.
And her brother Wolcott would bring boys from St. George's Church in New York up in the summertime to get them out of the city. Kind of a very informal boys' camp idea. After a couple of years, Aunt Sally said, Wolcott, you've got your own land. Go build your own camp. But there are pictures at Nonsuch of the boys with their boats.
So they started out in Nonsuch.
They started out at Nonsuch.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
We, in the archives, we have some photographs of a road in front of the...
There was a road until the 38 hurricane.
Yes.
38 hurricane took it out. The road only went as far as Nonsuch. It never went as far as the present Old Line Beach Club. And it was just a really kind of a grass road. It wasn't much of a, but it was a road, and people came down and parked.
Yeah. Was Nonsuch is still going, right?
Nonsuch is still going, but you don't have to go out and pump the water out of the well. It
Okay.
does.
Tell
But
us about
It's
that.
a wonderful cottage because it's not been modernized very much. It did get a slightly larger kitchen, but not much, and it did get a half bath.
Uh-huh.
But still, if you want to take a shower, you got to take it outside.
Oh, that's great. There's a wonderful story about you and Uncle Townsend and sitting in, just as the hurricane, you're at Nonsuch? What is
Yeah,
this?
the 38 hurricane, 21st of September, 1938, turned into a beautiful day. It had been raining for a couple of days, but that morning turned into a beautiful day, and the Ludingtons were about to move from spending the summer in Old Lyme back to Philadelphia, where they spent the winter, Ardmore. And my parents said, oh, let's have a last lunch down at Nonsuch. So my parents and Constance and Townie Ludington went down to Nonsuch. Well, the weather started to change, and my mother and Aunt Constance said, well, I think we should go. But the men were, no, that's fine. My mother and Aunt Constance were looking out the side window looking towards the beach club, and between them were two large bathhouses. And all of a sudden, the two women looked at one another and said, "Where are the bathhouses?" One minute they were there, and one wave came and they were gone. And at that point, my mother said, "I am leaving." The cars would not start because they were peppered with salt water, salt air. So they all climbed out the back window, walked up the hill to my mother's aunt's house, which is now the Marsh house on the top of the hill. And my mother spent the majority of the hurricane in the attic watching White Sand Beach just go, building by building, half a building here, a whole building there.
Wow.
It was really pretty spectacular.
And you were in school there, right?
I was in school. My brothers, being older, had already left to go home on the school bus, but the younger kids were still in school. And when a giant tree went down right beside our classroom windows, the powers that be at the school said, all kids will now go to the gymnasium, which was on the inside. They had a building all around it.
But now, where was the school? Was it Central School? The Central School hadn't been built yet, right?
At that time, there was only one school building, which is the center school.
Okay, and that,
There were no other school buildings.
Okay.
That was,
so you were
know,
in the center school?
Yeah, it was in center school. And we all sat on the floor in the gymnasium. I remember they handed us out oranges, and I can remember being terribly upset because I wanted to be allowed to use the phone to tell my mother that I wasn't going to come home on the school bus. And they couldn't penetrate my thick head that there was no telephone working. And I can remember sitting there with my orange being very angry that they wouldn't let me use the phone.
But didn't they evacuate you?
Yep, so then after the storm was over in the late afternoon, they pranced us all down, and some of us were taken to Boxwood, and some were taken to the old Line Inn, which was down on Ferry Road.
Right.
And
where
I went to Boxwood, and they put us in the building behind the main Boxwood building, which is where basically the servants slept. But this was after the season, so they were basically empty rooms. And as I recall, they put two kids to a bed, and there we were. And in the middle of the night, my father appeared with a flashlight, and he had walked all the way from the beach first to our house on Mile Creek Road to find out that his sons and daughter and all were fine there. There was no problem. And then where was I? And then he walked up, in the middle of the night, he took me by the hand. And when I think about it now, I think it was a stupid and very dangerous thing to do. We climbed over live wires, we climbed over trees, under trees, to get from Boxwood to my grandmother's house at the end of Academy Lane.
Wow.
And I can remember being very thrilled with the idea, since my grandmother had her bridge ladies there that day. Her guest rooms were full of 3 extra people. So I got to sleep on the sofa, and I thought that was pretty neat.
My God, that's an amazing story.
Yeah, I thought
Yeah.
that was really...
So you stayed here in Old Lyme, or did you when you grew up?
When I got to high school age, I went away to school.
And where did you go?
I went to Shipley outside of Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. And after
the war was still going on, and my parents drove me down there, and then my father said, "That's it. You want to come home at any time, you're going to have to come on the train." And I can remember being absolutely terrified. It was fine going from Philadelphia to New York because there were a lot of the girls from the school going to New York. But once you got to New York, they all got off. and plus you had to, you had to
You
change trains. And you had to change railroad stations,
From Penn Station
Yeah,
to.
you had to get from Penn Station to Grand Central, and I can remember being absolutely terrified. And the trains were just absolutely packed with servicemen.
And you can remember.
Army, Navy, the trains were absolutely jam-packed full.
Wow. And you would get off at Saybrook?
Then you get out, you go to Saybrook.
Wow, and how did you, and then your family would come pick you up there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But those are the days when the bridge across the Connecticut River was a drawbridge.
Ah,
And there were many a time on a Sunday night when guests that had come for the weekend and had to get back to New York, and you try to go across the bridge, and the bridge would raise up.
and so you wouldn't make the train?
Many a train was missed.
Right, right. So after you graduated from Shipley, where did you go?
I went to Boston for 2 years at a college that no longer exists, that was taken over by Simmons.
Simmons.
I think, yeah, right. But I went there for 2 years, but then I went to New York, and I went to the Parsons School of Design for 2 more years.
2 more years.
Yeah.
And what was your intent?
I was interested in interior design. Just as a child, my mother was very unhappy with me because she loved dolls, and she had one particular doll that was her favorite doll, and I couldn't have cared less about dolls. As I said, all I wanted to do was follow my brothers and do what they were doing, But my grandmother gave me her dollhouse, and I always loved the dollhouse. I just loved putting all the furniture in and changing it around.
Right.
And although I didn't like to play with dolls, I did like that dollhouse.
And what happened to the dollhouse?
I gave it to the Colonial Dames up in
You did?
Weathersfield.
Okay.
They have it presently up there.
They do?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So you met a gentleman named Tony Whitley,
Yes, he was already at Parsons when I got there.
and you met there,
Yeah, yeah.
and was it love at first sight?
No, not really at all. They're just your typical college. You're that age, and there's just lots of people, and you all go. But you find that you tended to go to the same places. I think we both discovered we really loved opera. I can't tell you how many times we just stood in the back. Now, don't buy a ticket. You just could go in
Stand
for a very nominal fee, and you could stand.
It's the Metropolitan, the old Metropolitan?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Did you ever go to Lincoln Center?
Lincoln Center didn't exist.
I know it didn't, but later on, did you go there?
Well, a few times later,
Yeah.
but by that time we had kids, and you didn't do it
Right.
that much. But
So when did you and Tony get married?
in 1954, we got married.
Here in Old Lyme? Or?
Yep, they got married a week before Christmas, and one would expect the weather to be cold, maybe snow even.
Right.
One does not expect to have pouring rain.
Oh my.
And as I recall, 2 men carried me into the church, all wrapped up in, I don't know what, bed sheets or something to preserve the dress more than me, I think.
Now, was this a wedding dress that your mother had? Or?
It was my grandmother's wedding dress, which had come from Paris.
Wow.
Her great aunt, her great aunt had sent it from Paris for her. So the dress is still going strong. It's been worn quite a few times over the years by various
Has
people.
your daughter worn? Did she wear it?
No, actually she didn't. My daughter gave us 3 weeks' notice that she was getting married in the middle of the summer.
Okay.
You try to find a wedding dress the very end of July.
I see.
No, she
Yeah.
didn't, because she got married down at the beach, and so it was pretty
Okay,
informal.
right. So going back to you and Tony, did you live here in Old Lyme, or did you?
No, we lived in New York, basically, and then for quite a while we lived out in Queens, in a wonderful apartment complex. I don't know if it still exists, but it covered many, many blocks, and the buildings were out on the street side, and in the interior, and this is not just 1 or 2 blocks, there was large areas in the center that were just like a park. And so it was great for kids because they could go ride their bicycles or
Oh,
run, and there were, playgrounds here and there, and it was really, you could have the city life, but you also weren't just confined to city streets.
Right.
So it was very nice, but we wanted, we'd like to have our own house, and we looked and looked and looked, and finally said, this is ridiculous. We're not finding anything, so we'll have to build what we want. And at that time, you had to get way out of New York to buy land that one could afford
Right.
and still afford to build a house. So we ended up in Bedford.
Oh, really? You live in Bedford there?
Yeah,
In
well,
Westchester,
Katona's part of Bedford,
Uh-huh,
the town.
right.
It's like another village. We actually had bought land that had originally belonged to John Jay, the first Attorney General.
Right, right.
And so it was very nice. There were, I think there were 4-acre lots that had been divided off from the original. The house is still open as a museum.
Ah, really? Oh, great. That's great. So, so you did move to Old Lyme, though, eventually, right?
Well, after, yeah, my husband finally got tired of, you never saw his house in daylight in the winter except on weekends. So he finally just got fed up with that, and he said, I'm retiring. And I said, you're a little young to retire. He said, well, I've always wanted an antique shop. I said, well, do you care where your antique shop is? No, not really. And I said, how about Old Lyme? And he said, if I can have Dick French's antique shop, then yes. Dick French, having had rented space on Lime Street for many, many, many years.
Where was it located on Lime Street?
Right across from the present-day Old Lyme Youth Center daycare building. And he had rented this space from Muriel Saunders for years and years and tried to buy it, and she would not sell it to him. And so when my husband said, well, he'd really like to have that shop, if he could have that shop, then he would move to Old Lyme. And so I called up Muriel Saunders, who was the mother of one of my classmates at school. And I said, Mrs. Saunders, will you sell me your shop, your building on Lime Street? Oh, yes, says she. Dick French never spoke to us again.
Oh, we didn't? Oh, dear. Oh.
Well, needless to say, I don't blame the man. He was furious.
Yeah.
Uh,
So you had this, what did you call your antique shop?
It was Whitley Antiques, and then it immediately turned to Whitley Antiques and Gallery, because my husband immediately got very, very interested in the Old Lyme Impressionist painters.
Uh-huh.
And so
And
he
pairing them,
started collecting them like crazy.
And,
Yeah.
and how long did you have the shop?
Well, Angel Lee died in 1993.
Uh-huh.
And that was the end of that. Everyone said, "Oh, are you gonna keep the business open?" And I was like, absolutely not. I'm not the dealer, I'm just the gopher.
Okay. So you retired.
It was a, yes, so I retired.
And so you lived in this house until very recently, and you moved?
Well, we lived in a small apartment behind the shop building. Luckily, Dick French had made a so-called apartment behind his, when he was using the building as his antique shop. It wasn't, he didn't really live in it. I mean, if he had to spend a night there, or if he had guests coming or overnight, he would put them there, but it was very small and he didn't really live in it. But thank goodness it was there, otherwise I doubt the town would have allowed us to improve it. We improved it quite a bit, but even so, at first I thought this is going to be wonderful, just having a small space to take care of, one bathroom instead of 4, this is going to be great. Well, within months, my husband and I were like, screaming at one another, falling over one another. It just, so my husband blithely told the gal next door, "You want to sell your house, I'll buy it." And I was a little horrified that he'd done that, but he got along with her so well. And by golly, within just a very short time, she found that she loved gardening, and she found that she really was getting too old. She couldn't really garden the way she wanted. She knew my husband would take care of her garden, so she sold us her house. And there again, we made lots of enemies because her kids were furious with her that she never actually, if she wanted to sell her house, why didn't she put it on the market?
Okay. So she just without realtors involved, she just sold it.
So that was very nice, because that was wonderful then to just, have plenty of room and be right next door. So that worked out for us beautifully.
Yeah, well, that's great. Muffy, we have to wind this up, but I wanted to ask you one final question. What do you think makes Old Lyme so special?
That is very difficult, because you're dealing with so many different people, and now you've got more and more. There for so many years, it was always the same families that lived here, and whether they were rich or poor, big or small, it was always the same families, and I think that kind of set the tone for the town for many, many years. But of course, that's not true now, as everything changes.
So, so you're now living at Chester Village West, right?
Right. It's a perfect solution for me.
Good.
The only problem with it is it's not in Old Lyme.
Okay. All right, it's lovely to talk with you, and I really appreciate that you've taken the time to be with us.
Well, you and I go back a lot of years,
We
Allison.
do indeed, and I'm moving to Chester Village so we can see you more there, so.
Well, that will be great.
Right.
Yeah, it's a nice group of people.
Okay, thank you. This ends our interview, and thank you so much.
We're very welcome.